My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 11th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of August 9th, 2026, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to begin this week's podcast, and I am excited because this gospel text in particular this week, I think is a very familiar text, and it's one of the texts that I remember from the first year that I did the podcast. There was one of the podcasts that I kind of will recommend checking out aspects of that this week. But I think it's also a text that when we get into it, there's a lot of different directions and where we can go. And I think it also gives us moments then with having so many different directions in which we can go, talking about and really causing us to reflect and think about things. And again, as I keep reiterating week after week after week, in this season after Pentecost, it is green. We are in a growing season. This is a season that should be challenging. This should be a season that forces us to look forward and how do we keep growing. A plant doesn't just grow by itself. It's putting itself out there consistently in order for it to grow. So thus we should be doing the same. So I think that's where when we look at these texts and we think about these texts in that context, it allows us to really see the difficulty that these texts bring, but also the fruit that can come from it if we put ourselves through those difficult times. And it's amazing in life as we walk through this life, the more times that we are able to endure and go through difficult times, a lot of times there is other things on the other side of that that are beyond what we can fully imagine. And a lot of these texts that we have this week help bring us to that point. But before we get there, we need to look back to last week's question, which was, where are you seeing God's blessings in the everyday? And I think it's really easy for us to overlook them. It's amazing, like when we're in a growing season, like right now, when you're going out into a garden, at least here in the Northern Hemisphere, and being able to see like, oh, look, I have fruits and vegetables. And we talked about vitamin C last week on how that then can help benefit me. And it's easy for us to forget that the longer we go. But hindsight, there's also times that it's easy for us to forget the blessings of every day because we don't acknowledge them, or it's so second nature that we forget to give blessings to it. For instance, we all need air to breathe. We all need oxygen to be able to be breathed in for our body to be able to function in the way that it's designed to function. And when those types of things are taken away from us, or again, like I've kind of talked about at different times this summer in northern Minnesota, we've had smoke days. When that is taken away from us and we're talking about don't go outside or all these things, we start recognizing the true blessing of what that is. And we don't like it when it's taken away from us. So I think part of the practice that we need to be doing as Christians is recognizing consistently the blessings that are there that are easy for us to overlook. And in doing that, it helps bring us closer to the Creator and acknowledging the beauty of what is going on around us. So let's just jump into it this week. One of the Old Testament texts you can have this week is out of Genesis chapter 37, the first 4 verses, and then 12 through 28. This is a story that you're probably somewhat familiar with, if you at least had some interaction with the faith, and it's Jacob and how he has his son Joseph and this coat of many colors, or coat of colors, that is shown and given to him because he is the favorite of Jacob's. And what do the brothers do? Just like any person, it seems like our own pride, our own ego gets in the way where we get jealous. And so when Joseph comes to check on his brothers, they come up with a scheme to essentially beat him and initially kill him, and then decide not to kill him and see another opportunity to actually profit off of their brother and end up sending him off to Egypt to be a slave there, and they got 20 pieces of silver for this process. Now, granted, we'll probably be going through this story a little bit more through the following weeks, but we also even have in this, which kind of give a little bit of a foretaste of where we're going, looking at verse 19, talking about how he is a dreamer. Joseph is forward-looking and a bit of a one who is imagining things and seeing things before they're happening. And so thus we have to be able to acknowledge that as well, that sometimes when we're having these big dreams, we're having these big ideas, the world isn't necessarily ready for them. And no matter how hard that is, those are sometimes the people we need to be willing to embrace, because sometimes they are helping us move in the direction in which we're needing to go. The psalm then that goes with that is Psalm 105, starting at verses 1 to 6, 16 to 22, and 45b. I love when they include like these 45b's. Praise the Lord. Just this aspect of making sure we recognize what is going on. But first and foremost, what we're going through here is acknowledging the gifts of what God has done for God's people. But it's also then remembering the miracles of what has gone on. And this is where they kind of give a little bit further story of what ends up happening here with Joseph. It's that first, you have Abraham, who has children of Jacob, who then has the offspring of Joseph, that when he is sold into slavery, that there is multiple times that the Lord steps in to make sure he is guiding the path, and that in ways this ends up benefiting the family later on. So this recognition on how God is out in front of Joseph, making sure that things are going to be okay, and it's still going to work to the benefit of where God is wanting to steer God's people at that time, and recognizing that as we are moving forward through this and as we continue to turn toward God, there is this beautiful recognition that God is still going to take care of us and is moving us in that direction. This also kind of ties into the other alternative Old Testament text this week, which is out of 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 9 to 18. This is a moment here where Elijah is getting scared. The people are wanting his life, so he goes and runs and hides away from them. And so God then comes up and talks where I am going to pass by, I'm going to talk with you. And there's all these grandiose things. We have earthquakes, we have fires, we have breaking rocks, splitting mountains, great winds. And that's not where God is. God is in this sheer silence as we get in verse 12. And again, God is asking, and then because of the silence, as Elijah comes out covered in the veil to be able to see the Lord pass by, the Lord then, go back to these people. You're going to anoint these two kings, but you're also going to anoint your next prophet, Elisha. And this is helping then to guide Israel to make sure the ones that have not bowed down to other gods, in this case Baal, but making sure that this is a guiding principle of, yes, you have gone through, you have done this, but we are continuing to move forward, and I'm going to continue to bless the people of Israel. The psalm that goes with that then is Psalm 85, starting in verse 8 to 13. And this is, again, this text of the Lord is this salvation, this person who is able to guide us through fear, is God willing to help us through all of this because of the steadfast love that God has for us. So thus, we have to lean into that and trust that, and not trust on our own understanding, but recognize that because of the love that God has for us, so thus, we should be able to trust that instead of our fear. The epistle text or second reading this week is out of Romans chapter 10, starting at verse 5 to 15. This is a text where, again, it's reminding us of how God has continued to be faithful to the line of people that God has continued to save, the people of Israel, and how God has continued to be there for us. So thus, it's also this recognition is, as long as we are willing to confess with our mouth and our heart that Christ is Lord, and that we are not just putting it on, that we are truly believing it, that then thus God doesn't show this distinction. We are part of the family of God. So thus, as long as we are then living that out, moving that out, sharing the faith, sharing the good news, this is what this is all about. That is what faith is all about, is continuing to move in the direction where God is steering us. The gospel text then this week is out of Matthew chapter 14, starting at verse 22 to 33. We have here Matthew's version of Peter walking on the water, After a long day, he tells the disciples to go out on the sea. He's dismissing the crowds. He goes and prays, and they have gotten battered, and so the boat ends up getting out across the sea, and in the early morning, they see him walking on the water toward them. Initially, they are terrified. They say it's a ghost. Jesus immediately says to them, "Take heart and do not be afraid." Peter then asks for him to command him to come out. He does. Peter starts walking on the water and coming toward Jesus. He then notices a strong wind and becomes frightened and begins to sink and calls out to God to save him. Immediately, Jesus reaches out his hand to catch him. "You with little faith, why did you doubt?" When he gets in the boat, the wind ceased, and they worship him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." This recognition of what has happened, and the disciples getting it a little bit more here in chapter 14. But before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, do a shameless plugs. Working Preacher, if you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts or commentaries or discussions. Since I'm the ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, direction, different ways to be thinking about and going through these texts, especially being able to go through some of the different biblical scholars to help you in that endeavor. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, along with having the art, which is newly revised, prayers, hymns, liturgical colors, daily readings to get you into these texts to help prepare you for when you are going to go into worship. Again, you are able to go deeper the more you are in these texts, the more you are looking at them, the more you are able to continue to hear them, the more you're able to extract. So it makes that whenever your worship day is, it's not just a one and done experience. Make sure that it is a multiple day experience to really connect with the divine. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend that. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is in ecological echoes and implications and urgencies for the weekly lectionary, or it's also a monthly newsletter that contains some additional resources, events, some green notes, and things of that nature. I'd highly recommend checking this stuff out. If you enjoy listening to this podcast for half an hour each week, I know you're going to enjoy the resources over there. That'll be the first link down in the references section, so make sure to check out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. And finally, I'd also highly recommend, and again, I know I shout this out every week, but it's really worth it. Make sure you check out the Beyond the Argument, Where Science and Scripture Meet by Isang Nadali Teddy. It's a great article, especially as kind of an introduction talking about faith and science and how they do not compete against each other, but actually work together. If you are newer to this conversation, I'd highly recommend taking the time, going through that article. And if you haven't checked it out yet and you're listening to this podcast every week, this is one of my highly recommend reads. So I'd highly recommend checking out Beyond the Argument, Where Science and Scripture Meet by Isang Nadali Teddy. It is worth the read. I don't do this very often, and in particular, I don't like doing this personally, but this is a text that sticks out to me, and I would highly recommend checking something out, and I kind of teased it in the introduction. I'll link it down below. 6/24/2018. I talked about no need for fear, and this is going from Mark's interpretation of this text. It's worth going into because there is a lot of fear language here, and especially within science, fear is a one emotion that we can 100% test for, and there's some really good science talking about what is going on here and what we can learn about that in regards to our faith in general and how this impacts us and why God would be telling us not to fear. And to do a one sentence summary, because if we fear, we cannot live out the mission and what God has called us to do. And there is biological reasons on why. But that also leads us into this next part of it is if I'm not supposed to fear, when things get hard, when things get difficult, that means I have to keep leaning into trusting God in the process, even when it is hard. And over the last couple years, there's been some really interesting science that kind of is this way. And I feel like it ties into these texts really well if you give me a few minutes to kind of set it up. So let's get into it a little bit. Over the last 6 years, there has been conflicting studies going back and forth, trying to understand with how our world seems to be warming in overall temperature year after year. Like we've talked about multiple times before, the last 10 years in particular are basically the 10 warmest years on record when you're taking in consideration the whole globe. So in that, then we're able to kind of like piece together roughly like where is all of this temperature change coming from. And one of the things that has been difficult is technically the last 0.2 degrees Celsius has been hard to figure out each and every year. And in 2020, what started to come out was maybe some of this is due to the fact that we've actually been cleaning the environment. And what I mean by this is ship emissions. And so what they were stating in these papers is because we have cleaned the ship emissions and thus they are not putting soot into the atmosphere, thus, this isn't helping to form clouds. Now, what we have started to understand is there are high clouds and there are low clouds. Essentially, where are they in the atmosphere? And the difference is that we're finding is that high level clouds, so ones that are higher, closer to outer space, I guess if we want to put it that way, high clouds, those clouds absorb more solar radiation, thus amplifying warmth on Earth, thus being able to do the greenhouse effect, as you've probably heard multiple times when we're talking about this type of thing. Low-level clouds seem to reflect or essentially bounce back that solar energy. So that there has been these kind of debates talking about how essentially now because we have cleaner ships, we're not getting these ship trails of clouds, which is forming cloud formations. And so thus, when the sun is coming in, there isn't these clouds to potentially bounce it back. And so thus, that is where your 0.02 degrees Celsius is coming from. And even into 2026, this has gotten to the point where there is a lot of question back and forth. There's a lot of discussion where maybe somewhat it's happening, maybe not. And as science is continuing to test this, continue to look at this, there is discussion, we'll put it that way, back and forth on maybe there's some, maybe there's a little bit, maybe there's none. This is maybe over amplified. One of the things that it's very easy to do in a moment like this, especially when there is some controversy with this, is then why should we continue doing this? Like, what is the point? It's really easy to get discouraged where we're having one study saying, yeah, it's enough that when we start looking at it and looking at it over the compound of the earth that accommodates for this missing part that we're looking for, let's go with it. Meanwhile, we have to also remember the principle on what science is built upon is the aspect that things are repeatable, that we are able to have multiple studies to confirm this, essentially peer review, that it is a repeatable thing and thus continuing to build support for that hypothesis. If we aren't able to do that, then it makes it harder for us to be able to say, no, that maybe you had some weird structure with that. And so that's where there has been all these discussions. Are the clouds actually different? Coming from a paper in early 2026, discussing on the internal structure of the clouds do seem to be a little bit different when they were coming out of this. And is that really affecting things? And so thus we are in this true experiment phase with understanding how all of this is working. And this can be something that's easy to say, well, then maybe this is starting to show where maybe we do need to have the soot there to have some of the reflection to help. But then you're also getting some of this where it's like, no, it's not making that big of a difference. And we also then might just have to come to the reality of with the effects of El Nino that is going on currently, but just also the effects of what we have done to our environment, that things are getting warmer and we are going to have to pay a price for it. Let's look at our text a little bit and discuss this a little bit further. The brothers of Jacob, if we're looking at the Genesis text, initially are jealous. They're upset. They figure out a scheme to throw him in a pit and they're going to kill him. And basically, as they are having lunch, they see another opportunity, this glinter in their eye of something that potentially could be better. And so thus they sell him off into slavery to get some type of reward. And then they tell this whole lie eventually to their father that he died. Instead of being able to confront the issue, they figured out this elaborate scheme so that they came out ahead. And as you know where this goes, they end up being on their knees in front of him, begging for food. So this whole idea of what they thought was going to be for their gain, God ends up turning around and yes, ends up blessing the family, but there is a lot of repentance that needs to happen. 1 Kings, where Elijah is running for his life, and yet God still states, you have to trust the process here. I am in control here. God will still prevail. There will be other prophets. You have done what I've told you to do. Don't stop now. To Elijah. The Romans text talking about how we need to live out our faith is not just something that we say, but we have to also do. It's both and. It's this recognition that it's something that we have to walk out. Just because we have cleaned the emissions and potentially that it is reducing some things and we're seeing some potential heartache with that, that doesn't mean you stop. It shows that sometimes there's hardships to pay because we weren't acknowledging or recognizing or looking at what effects of what we were doing for our convenience was having on the rest of the globe. And we didn't want to think about the long-term ramifications of what that would be. Thus, similar to what the brothers, yes, God ended up blessing it in Genesis, but this recognition on how they weren't able to see beyond their own jealousy. Peter is the epitome of this multiple times in the Gospels. Peter is bold enough to say, have me come out. And he is walking on the water. He is looking at Jesus. And then things start getting rough. He starts noticing things. The wind is strong. I'm walking on water. I've never done that before. He loses sight of what he should be looking at, and thus he starts to drown. Is it important research and understanding this cloud structure and what is going on? Yes. But if we take this data and start twisting it, contorting it, and saying that this is data to either confirm or deny on whether or not we need to be continuing with our use of fossil fuels, is not helpful. We are losing sight of what Christ is telling us to do. We know through multiple different things that the more carbon that we put into the atmosphere, it is warming the environment. It doesn't matter on whether or not this is allowing for cloud reflection back into the atmosphere. We are losing sight then of what is going on. That is what is happening. Yes, the world, we are having warm days. We are having warmer years in general. We have to acknowledge that, look at that, and realize that there may not be quick and fast solutions to that. But we have to keep our eyes on the prize and not shortcut it. The brothers shortcutted it and got extremely lucky. If you think about it, if Joseph had been there, their family would have been able to thrive much better, because of the visions that God was giving Joseph. Instead, he ended up, yes, helping the whole tribe because of the God that we have. But it doesn't mean we discount and just say God's going to do everything. God is putting us in position to have impact. We have to be willing and able to acknowledge it and listen to it. Too often, we are getting called out, we start doing things, and thus then we get scared. And I know myself, that's happened. And we have to just trust and continue to walk out and walk there with Jesus and not be caught off guard with shortcuts or things that look scary. You just keep pressing forward. We're quickly approaching here episode 450, and like I do with every 50 podcasts or so, I like kind of giving an update, kind of summarizing things. And I'm not going to spoil that too much right now. But what I will say, this year, there has been a lot of crazy things that have happened. And I can't explain all of it. I'm not going to try to explain all of it, but I'm trusting that something else is going on that's beyond what I understand. I also know that there are things within myself that I look at where I'm letting myself down and what God is calling us to do, because there's goals and aspirations that I had that I still have not fulfilled. But that doesn't mean that I should just stop and abandon them. It means that I need to figure out ways to be able to do this more efficiently, figure out ways to be able to help provide this better. And we'll get into that a little bit more here. This is episode 449. So next week's 450, and then we'll have a special episode. Congratulations. There's your little bit of the tease that's coming. So we have to acknowledge that, think about that, wrestle with that for us to continue to move forward. It is necessary for us to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus and listen to his voice. Not get caught up with the wind and the earthquakes and the fire like Elijah that easily could have. God was in the sheer silence, waiting. We too have to trust where God is steering us, trust all of this, and continue to move forward. Even when the data gets difficult to understand, gets complicated, gets complex, we still have to stay rooted in where Christ is taking us. We do not need to fear. We have to continue to trust and move forward out of that place. And even when the data is complicated and complex, continue to trust that the more we work with this, the more we will understand. And don't get twisted and just say, well, then this is a reason to stop doing this. No, we've been called to take care of this place, so thus we need to be continuing to work toward that. Let's not continue to take steps backwards because it's convenient, because it's easy, because the work in which we are called to do, as we are talked about in Romans, is not easy work. It's work of both saying it with our mouth, embedding it within our being, and walking it out. All three of those. And there's nowhere in there that it should just be quote unquote convenient. So we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.